It's summer, the time of year when people head to vacation spots around the country. After months of living in the city and suburbs, summer beckons you to the great outdoors. We head to the beach or to the mountains or to a cabin on the lake for a week or two. Maybe you're one of the lucky ones who doesn't have to rent and you own a second home somewhere.
I think it's got the deepest and clearest water of any lake in the U.S. So they're constantly measuring the depth and clarity of Lake Tahoe.
Amy Westervelt lives in Truckee, California. That's just up the road from Lake Tahoe.
It's like a major talking point every month here.
Tahoe's natural beauty is a huge draw for tourists, especially those from the Bay Area, which is about a 3.5-hour drive. Many of them have bought second homes.
So coming out my house, I've got on the right of me a second home, on the left of me a second home. Both of those, we see the people maybe once a quarter.
The folks who buy these houses often pay $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 for a second home.
Across the street is a vacation rental. It really doesn't get rented that much. I'd say maybe 3 times a year.
Westervelt is a freelance journalist. A busy freelance journalist who's been renting in Truckee for about 5 years.
I write for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and then I also do radio reporting for a lot of local NPR stations, and I produce several podcasts.
I heard one of Amy's documentaries in the podcast The View from Here. She says the area around Lake Tahoe is gorgeous, but there's a dark side to this beautiful place. Lots of those vacation homes sit empty for much of the year, while people with modest incomes can't afford a place to live.
There are people living in cars pretty often, which this is a pretty severe winter area. In fact, actually, Truckee often has the lowest temperatures in the country during the winter. So it's definitely not great.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them, the podcast where we tell stories about America's culture divides. I'm Trey Kay. The affordable housing shortage around the Lake Tahoe area got me thinking about the movie Dirty Dancing. If you don't remember the plot of that flick, a doctor takes his family for a vacation at a summer resort in New York's Catskill Mountains. The resort is staffed by a crew of working-class people who serve the guests and in some cases keep them entertained with activities like dance lessons. At some point, the doctor's youngest daughter, Baby, discovers the resort staff have after-hours parties in their quarters and is surprised and intrigued by their dancing.
Where'd they learn to do that?
Where? I don't know. Kids are doing it in the basements back home. Want to try it? Come on, baby.
Now, before you start to think we're doing a show about the us and them class differences in dance styles, that's not where we're headed. But note to self, consider an us and them show about dancing. No, what we're focused on is how places like Tahoe, like the resort in Dirty Dancing, are playgrounds for the wealthy. And workers are needed to make the playground run smoothly. Now, you might be thinking, why should I care if rich people can't get a decent latte or have to wait a little longer to get their skis waxed? But that's not the issue we're raising. We're talking about the people who cook the food, wait on the tables, clean rooms, mow lawns, manicure the golf course, muck out the stables. And at the end of the day, those same workers need a place to lay their heads, so they can get up and do it all again the next day. But based on what Amy Westervelt tells me, working class Tahoe folks are finding it harder and harder to find a place to live near where they work. And this shortage of affordable living accommodations for workers in affluent vacation communities is a problem that's happening in places all across the nation. For this episode, we're going to check in with a few journalists across the country who've been reporting about this localized us and them housing divide. First, let's hear more from Amy Westervelt.
We have a pretty brisk tourism industry here, both in the summer and in the winter. When there's ski season, there are about 8 or 9 different resorts all around the lake. It's one of these places where there's not really any place that's close enough and cheap enough that it makes sense for people to like live outside the basin and commute to work. So you kind of need to have some amount of affordable housing for folks that work at the resorts and the restaurants and all those things that keep the tourism going.
So at one time, were there affordable houses, or is it just gotten to the point where what once was affordable has now become outpriced to the people who need that type of housing?
It's always been like, people around here will say, oh, it's never been easy to live in Tahoe. So like the kind of thing that locals always say is that you know a local because they have at least 3 jobs. But it's gotten just particularly bad in the last 5 years. There's been a little bit of a tipping point, and most people will point to Airbnb and VRBO as kind of the key shift in that.
How does that factor?
So there's a bunch of homes that are second homes that at one point landlords might have rented out long term that have been converted to short-term rentals and vacation rentals. That's happening a lot. Like, I've interviewed several people who have basically been asked to leave a long-term rental because the owner is converting to a vacation rental. And, you know, for owners, it makes sense. You can make as much in a week almost as you could in a month, and you don't have to deal with long-term renters. So I understand, like, if you had a house and you had spent a lot of money on it and you wanted to get some kind of return, you know, vacation rental seems like the way to go. But that leaves a lot of houses that used to be available for rent that are no longer there.
When you say that the you can tell a local is because they have 3 jobs, it's that those are the people who are doing the waiter jobs and the groundskeeping jobs and those types of things. And if they don't have those people to kind of do those services to the community doesn't function, no?
Right, exactly. Well, and then kind of related to that, it's also the teachers and the nurses and the policemen who make it possible for what I call like a real town to exist, you know, because if you lose those people, then it becomes kind of a tourist village, you know, that everyone sort of drives into and drives away from. And right now, I think there are still a few towns around the lake that function as kind of normal year-round communities, but it's getting harder and harder for them to do that.
In your piece, you interview a person by the name of Stacy Caldwell, who is from the Mountain Housing Council. And she makes this suggestion about unlocking some of the vacant homes in the area.
Yeah.
First of all, I'd like to know, what exactly does it mean to unlock? Do you just basically somebody come along with a master key and say, we're opening this home, you people who need it, come right on in? I mean, I know that may not be exactly right, but I mean, do these owners of the home actually, are they amenable to this kind of solution?
Yeah, to varying degrees. So there are a few examples of things people have kind of just like worked out amongst themselves. So one is a guy that we talked to who was looking for a place when he first moved up here. And I think it was like a friend of a friend introduced him to someone who owned a second home. And they worked out this deal where he functioned as sort of like a caretaker. And then, you know, he was like, whenever you want to come up, just give me, you know, a week's notice and I can either go camping or go stay with a friend or whatever. And it actually worked out that they became friends and almost like roommates. And so then when this guy sold that house and bought another house, he brought his, you know, kind of local roomie with him. And because he was like, this is a great setup.
But this kind of creative, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your solution is much more the exception for locals searching for affordable housing in the area. In her documentary, Westervelt got a tour from Heidi Hill Drum, executive director of the Tahoe Prosperity Center. Drum showed her the kind of places that many working-class locals are resorting to.
There is a plethora of old rundown motel properties throughout the area. Those are those motels that were built back in the 50s prior to the Olympics in 1960. And they're still here, and they haven't been upgraded, and they haven't been renovated, and they're acting as de facto affordable housing for many of our local workers. The problem is that we can't turn them into workforce housing because they are expensive.
Bill Roby, executive director of the El Dorado Community Foundation, explains to Westerfeld why the area's motels have become de facto apartment buildings.
They come into being because there's a population set here that isn't able to afford the first and last month's rent. And so they end up moving into something like this because they can pay as they go along. So future's a little bit uncertain, as is employment at times, because it's seasonal, depending upon the flow of people in and out of Tahoe. So we find places like this popping up that are serving the individuals in a manner, but they're charging them much more than if they were in a traditional lease or rental situation in the community.
So then they end up in a position where they can't ever.
Right, they're trapped. Right, because
when you were talking about how the community will kind of get together and periodically and kind of assess this problem, and I'm imagining that there would be some of these low-income people who are concerned that they want to find an affordable place to live. Mm-hmm. Have you been to meetings like that where they show up and kind of voice their opinion?
Yeah.
And really what I'm looking for is, I'd like to know, can you sense resentment?
Yes.
That there's like kind of a us and them
yes.
Feeling.
Very much. Yeah, that's definitely growing. Despite all of the information that's been out there around this topic, especially for the last couple of years, there's still kind of a lack of awareness in the second homeowner community that this is a real problem here. So I'll give you an example. I talked to a guy who is very wealthy. He owns, 4 or 5 houses around Tahoe, and he lives in the Bay Area. And I was talking to him, and he was complaining about the one affordable housing development that's kind of been okayed in the last few years, which is going up in Truckee. It's a redevelopment of a rail yard, and it's, I think, 95 or so lofts, and they're making, 90% of them are income restricted. So really you have to make at or below a certain level. And the community is really excited about it. And this guy was like, oh, I can't believe they're doing that. It's going to be so ugly. It's going to totally ruin the character of downtown Truckee and all this stuff. And so I just asked him where he likes to go in town. And he kind of, this cafe and that bar. I was like, well, where do you think that those people live in town? Because there's not a secret neighborhood with all these low rent cottages,
Right.
that you've just never seen. And he's like, oh, I guess I never really thought about that. And I feel like that's pretty common, so there is kind of this symbiotic relationship, but a little bit of resentment for sure.
After a short break,
people want to come live their winter dream as a ski bum.
the housing squeeze for seasonal workers in Colorado. I'm Trey Kay, and this is Us and Them, which is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Next up, we head east to the mountains. Summer isn't the only time we head for the hills. Winter recreation attracts 20 million of us to ski slopes and winter sport. And the Colorado Rockies is one of the nation's top destinations. Kevin Fixler is a reporter for the Press Democrat. He's covered the housing beat in both California and Colorado.
Back when I used to work for the Summit Daily News, which is in the Breckenridge, Colorado area, we covered housing very closely because there are incredible shortages of housing for the workforce.
Fixler says that towns that live and die from the snow ski industry in the Colorado Rockies are facing the same housing puzzle as the towns around Lake Tahoe.
What it comes down to is sort of a battle between local governments and the businesses that make the community function.
The towns need more affordable housing, just like Tahoe. But who's responsible for providing it?
That is sort of the question. It depends on what side you fall on, really. Is it the government's job to provide housing, to purchase land, to tax the community in order to provide these accommodations, or should it be the businesses? And by that, because it is a ski community, the largest businesses are usually looked to provide for their employees. And the question then becomes, in Summit County, predominantly, is Vail Resorts, which is a $400 million annual company that operates around the world.
So I'm imagining that both sides realize that there's a problem. For example, what would an organization like Vail Resorts do to try to reduce the problem with housing seasonal service workers?
Sure. Well, I mean, in an ideal world, there'd be plenty of open land, and it would be free, and they'd be able to build at low cost and put people up for the season. Unfortunately, land is scarce in that community. 80% of that region is made up of U.S. Forest Service land, which you obviously cannot build on unless you're the U.S. Forest Service. So what Vail has done is they actually, in December of 2015, stated that they would provide $30 million plus their own land in a couple instances across Colorado, California, and Utah in order to try and meet the growing need for seasonal workers. They've accomplished one project in particular. They've gotten the early beginnings of infrastructure in to provide about 200 new units to service those people. But in the meantime, there's still a shortage. They're trying to figure out where to put these people. And in many instances, they're unfortunately having to cram people into dorm-style living situations and then even providing bunk beds in situations because there's just no other place to put them.
No other place? Why not look on the open market? Fixler says no dice. Apartments now rent for about $2,000 a month, and that's if you can even find a long-term seasonal rental. Fixler told me the vacancy rate is below 0.5%. But say you can score a rental. You're not going to be able to afford anything on the $10 to $15 hourly wage most seasonal employees earn. So to make the situation work, you'd have to share with some other workers, probably a lot of workers, to split the high rent. And multiple people jamming into a tiny pad is barely better than the dorms and bunks the resorts offer. How bad is this problem? How crucial is it? And if it's not solved, what's really at stake?
Yeah, I think what it comes down to is really a quality of your experience if you're a tourist visiting Colorado and you know you're on your dream vacation. And if there's long lift lines because they don't have enough employees to assist that, or maybe the runs aren't groomed the way you would expect, then you're probably not going to return. So again, we are talking about money that comes into that community. And you got to remember, it's not just going into the purchase of lift tickets or to the hotel, but it's for the businesses too. So people go to have something to eat or drink, and any other number of touristy type businesses, whether it's people selling clothing or knickknacks and other things, the coffee shops. I mean, everybody really relies on those tourists coming to the community. So if you're not able to supply the proper amount of housing or decent housing for the employees, then they're just not going to come, which is going to have an impact on the tourists, and then everybody sort of loses at that point.
Now, the way I understand it, Summit County probably in Colorado would have more of a progressive voting base. But when I think of places like Vail and Aspen, I think of wealthier, more affluent, and certainly Telluride would be similar to that too. Do you feel that those communities have as much interest in really looking out for the seasonal workers and making sure that they're not kind of crammed into cramped quarters, or is this something that's at the top of their list of something that they really need to address?
Well, I think the simple answer, it comes down to, it depends on your outlook. In Vail and Aspen, I don't think, based on, that voter base, they have as much focus on, the quality of life or quality of experience for these workers that they do rely on just as much to turn their lifts and provide those seasonal needs. But yeah, I mean, you do have a pretty progressive government out of Summit County. They've been able to get voters to pass a measure that allows them to tax the community on sales, on retail sales, and they'll get about $10 million annually to contribute toward building workforce housing. The other communities should be as interested, but I can't honestly say they probably are as progressive. Vail, for instance, was not able to pass a measure among its voter base for half that amount of money annually to build more housing for the workforce.
Do you find the not in my backyard thing is another issue that really complicates this?
I wouldn't call that prevalent. I would say that, yeah, it's probably a factor. But often where you're building this type of new employee housing, the people with money find ways to get away from those areas. So there's always sort of two sides to this. If you're new to the community, you sort of talk about the townies, right? People who want to prevent expansions and having a lot of newcomers to the community. On the other hand, you've got the people who are local and say, oh, well, the newcomers, the seasonal workers who are going to be here for one season sort of come in, party, wreck my community, and then leave. So there is always a constant tension. At the same time, I think both recognize the importance of the other, and it really does come down to finding a way to make it work.
This tension between the wealthy folks who own homes and pay property taxes and the seasonal workers who help keep the local economy humming becomes even more pronounced when the area is physically isolated, like the famed resort islands off the coast of Massachusetts.
The housing crisis on Nantucket has risen to a level where there is such limited amount of space for working class folks to live that they are now frequently found living on basement floors, on kitchen floors, in shipping containers, living in relatively extreme situations.
So you mean like shipping containers, like on a boat, going across the Atlantic? They basically have arranged those someplace on Nantucket Island, and people are living in them?
That's correct.
Oh, wow. This is David Abel.
I am a reporter at the Boston Globe.
I recently read a story that Abel wrote about what's happening on Nantucket. It's a lot like what's going on in Tahoe and the ski towns of Colorado, but there are a couple unique wrinkles. Nantucket has a year-round population of about 12,000 people. That balloons to more than 50,000 people during the summer.
So on Nantucket, it is increasingly challenging to find a reasonably priced place to live. The median price for a home is $1.5 million. And an average two-bedroom apartment now typically rents for about $3,000 a month.
All of this is way out of reach for a minimum wage worker. And yet, living off the island isn't really feasible either. A round trip on the slow ferry starts at $37. So a full-time employee earning $11 an hour, Massachusetts minimum wage, could spend as much as 42% of their gross income just on commuting.
People who work there generally live there.
And just to drive the point home, I've been to Nantucket before, and I think that to get there, at least an affordable way to get there, is that you need to take a ferry. And the ferry, I think, takes 2.5 hours to get from, say, Hyannisport to Nantucket.
Well, there are higher speed ferries that you could take that can get you there in a shorter time. But right, for the more affordable ferry, it can take about 2 hours to get there.
So, I mean, that just doesn't seem reasonable to work, I don't know, what, a 6 hours, 8 hour shift and then go 2.5 hours to get to Nantucket and then to get back to the mainland. It just seems like living someplace off of the island just doesn't seem like an option.
Right. And the ferries are not always on time, and they're subject to weather conditions. So, right.
Who are these people? I mean, the people who are the seasonal workers, are they immigrants? And is there, I guess, some type of antipathy of or concerned that we don't want those people here, people of a different race, people who may be seen as illegal immigrants, et cetera. Is there any type of that vibe that's going on?
A large number of the seasonal employees who work on Nantucket doing a range of jobs like mowing lawns and grooming golf courses are part of exchange programs, essentially foreign worker programs, and they come from all over the world to work on Nantucket. And there's a special visa that these programs use to bring over folks from places like the Philippines and elsewhere, and that could be part of the issue.
David, I imagine that there are people in Nantucket who see this as a problem and they're trying to work towards a solution, right?
I think there's a broad consensus throughout the people who live on Nantucket year-round that there is a need for more affordable housing.
And there's a group on Nantucket, I think they're called the Nantucket Land Bank, and they're like a public agency that basically monitors the area and where you can and can't build. And I think they have sought to address this problem, right?
The Nantucket Land Bank is an organization that was created by the legislature to oversee and conserve land throughout Nantucket. And part of its mission is it oversees recreational lands as well. And so it bought a golf course, and they need workers to keep it running. And for years, they've had their workers live in homes around the island. And it's been such a challenge for their workers to find housing, affordable housing in reasonable living conditions, that last year they proposed building a dormitory for those workers, about 18 of them. And that effort has been stymied by opposition from one specific neighbor who lives across the street from where this dormitory would be built.
And just to be specific, I mean, in your article, you point out that it's David Long, who's the CEO of Liberty Mutual.
That's correct.
What is his beef with this dormitory?
His lawyer has argued that the building of a dormitory would violate the Nantucket Land Bank's grants and what they're supposed to do. And the Longs have strenuously argued that they should not be permitted to build on that land, specifically creating housing, saying that they're not a housing agency, but a land protection agency.
Are there a lot of people from Nantucket who resonate with Long's argument?
You know, and the people that I interviewed for the article, the vast majority seem to side with the land bank, with the understanding that there is a necessity for affordable housing for their seasonal workers. That said, there are certainly some folks who share the concerns of the Longs and think that there might be other places where the workers should be housed.
Do you get a sense of what Nantucket residents think about what will happen if this seasonal housing problem isn't remedied?
I think that they understand that in some ways they have no choice but to find solutions to this issue, because the current situation in which many seasonal employees are living in sketchy situations on basement floors or kitchen floors, or sleeping right next to each other with sheets sort of dividing their spaces, that is not a situation that is a long-term solution.
Nantucket has made some progress in affordable housing for year-round residents. The Nantucket Housing Assistance Corporation built and opened 37 homes for folks that make 80% or less of the median income. Residents got to move in the first of this year. But housing for seasonal workers is still a vicious catch-22. If you look at the job sites for Nantucket, you can see that more than a few require workers to live on the island. When you have folks like Liberty Mutual CEO David Long blocking the building of a dormitory for workers on an island, where there are only a few places to build, you have to wonder how and if the housing crisis can be resolved on Nantucket. One answer is what Vail Resorts decided to do across California, Colorado, and Utah: fund and build housing to support their workers. Another solution is harder to come by because it involves the dreaded word, tax. Summit County, Colorado bit the bullet and added a tax on retail sales to support affordable housing. But there are a lot of places where that just wouldn't fly. And as I was finishing the writing for this story, Amy Westervelt emailed me to say that she was no longer sitting on the sidelines reporting on the housing problem in Tahoe. She's now in the thick of it. Her landlord is selling her house 9 months before the lease is up. And now she and her family have to find a new place to live. And just one more thing. I know you might be thinking, at a time when children are caged in internment camps along our southern border, and we've withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council, and our president is lavishing dubious praise on dictators, you'd be right to wonder if affordable housing in places like Tahoe rises to the same level of importance. Affordable housing is a pernicious problem for communities all across America. A decent place to lay one's head should be a given, regardless of whether you arrived in the U.S. last week or generations ago. It's a simple equation. Good housing equals good homes equals good communities. And by the way, separating migrant children from their parents and placing them in concentration camps is a topic we addressed in another episode, A Suburb of Hell, which you can find at usandthempodcast.com. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode is me, Trey K, Chris Julin, Loretta Williams, and Mitch Hanley. Special thanks to Scott Hellman at the Boston Globe for facilitating my interview with David Abel, and also to Amy Westervelt for the audio from her Beneath the Surface of Tahoe documentary. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Additional music from Mitch Hanley. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The wonderful people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with the assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. Say, what are the Us and Them divides and issues in your area? Let us hear from you on Facebook or Twitter, or write to me, Trey, at usandthempodcast.com. And remember, there's no ampersand. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.